through a stroke of great fortune, I've found out not only who he was, but what his telephone number was, and I called him. Nobody knew about this man, apart from Sotheby's and the Japanese side. And I said to him that I was who I was, working with Carnegie and Jacob Rothschild, and had done this great exhibition of Persian material. And was there any chance for me to be given the opportunity by him to visit his collection, to see it? And he said, no, there's no way I want anybody to see this collection, and I'm not ever going to sell it, etc., etc. And from 1977, I think it was, Tom, until 1982, I called this man every year and wrote to him and sent him a case of really good claret every single year, and kept in touch with him. And suddenly, in 1982, I think it was 1982, he said to me, well, look, I am prepared for you to come over and have a look at the collection. I'm not interested in selling it, but you've taken the trouble to be in touch and we can go and have a look at it. It's actually in America, and it was sent out to America in 1939 before France was invaded.
Brought to you by Arcata, the anti-fraud and customer due diligence network for the art world. This is The Bigger Picture, an inside look at the businesses that make the art world work and the stories behind the people that shape them. Getting started in the business of art at 30, within 12 years, Michael Goedhuis had become the director of the oldest commercial gallery in the world and established records, brokering some of the most significant deals. Striking out on his own in 1982, Michael would go on to create new markets, discover culturally and historically important collections, while even becoming the subject of a film. Michael's career is a fascinating tale of a 50-year art world adventure. What's most striking looking at your life in the business of art is not only the speed with which you rose to prominence, but the significance of what you achieved in a little over 10 years before turning 40. A lot of people would have been quite satisfied having achieved what you had done in 20, 30 years, let alone a decade. To paint a picture, a degree in art history under the tutelage of British art historian Anthony Blunt from the Courtauld Institute, director of Carnegie, established a record for the sale of a Polonaise carpet for $1 million, brokered deals with major collectors like Prince Sadruddin Khan and institutions such as the Harvard and the Met. The list goes on, so let's just start here and enlighten the rest of us. To what do you attribute your success? Connections, luck, hard work?
Well, Tom, this is all very flattering, but it's not. It's not as, I don't think it's quite as successful as it sounds, so the way you describe it. But bless you for doing so. You know, I think that to what do I attribute to success? Well, number one, I think I'm a hard worker. My father is Dutch. He was a very hard worker until he died at the age of 90. He was a very distinguished international lawyer. Secondly, at Eton, I had a relatively undistinguished career, but then went straight into investment, to university, learned a couple of languages, European languages, went into investment banking, merchant banking in London with M. Samuel, and then went on they sent me off to Paris to join Banque de Suez, l'Union des Mines, which was a French banque d'affaires, and I was in Paris for some time. And I think that was a very sort of rich, varied background that helped me be enthusiastic about life and about investment, about investment banking, about finance. And at the same time in Paris, what I was doing was working, but also started a small art gallery in the 6e arrondissement in Paris with emerging artists, one American artist, and then two or three French artists. So that was great fun, and doing that at the same time I was banking.
And that would have been when you were 21, would it not? When you opened that gallery, that was while you were studying.
Yeah, but that was about 21. At Eton, I had become interested in art rather haphazardly. I think that, and I remember buying this. I mentioned it to you, buying this. Actually, it was a reproduction, a Renoir reproduction from a gallery in the High Street of Jean Renoir, of his son, Jean Renoir, who became the filmmaker. And it was a beautiful reproduction, a very famous one, which I gave to my mother. And that, somehow or other, that did register with me. And I went on and became interested in art, very much so.
But it was from that point, from 16, when you bought the reproduction and the gift for your mother. That was actually where it began.
Yeah, I think so.
But what was drawing you to the work of art at such a young age, to works of art?
Well, I don't, I don't know. It was well, it's a beautiful, famous painting of this little boy who drawing, and for some reason it attracted me. My parents also had, my father, a very cultivated man, had a painting, a very beautiful Dutch landscape in his study, which I was drawn to. So I think I was visually
Yeah,
alert, if you like.
you were exposed to it from a youngish age, essentially, and that was sowing the seeds. I think what will come as a surprise to some, though, I mean, you did just touch on this. You're mentioning investment banking, is that your move into the art world in your 30s, formally, if you will, was really preceded by a very, very, very different path entirely. In fact, it almost reads like you were leading a dual life, because you were an economist, you're an MBA graduate from the European Institute of Business Administration in your 20s. You were leading the London operations of a major investment bank. And that really seems to fuel your collecting, I think, from what connecting the dots. You started purchasing old master drawings and works by artists such as Lynn Chadwick and John Shapiro. Now, what's interesting, of course, is now while today these are significant names, in the late 60s you were really quite ahead of the curve. So what was it you saw in those artists back then?
When I was working in investment banking, initially in London and then America and then Paris and then back in London, I started buying old master drawings. And I also started buying, because I was making a certain amount of money in those days, 20th century masters, people like Albers and Léger and Sheila, beautiful Léger gouache, Sheila, etc. And I think that this became a passion of mine. I also became interested, and these were already famous names, but I also became interested in so-called people who were emerging to some extent. And I did buy, well, Albus was well known, but I bought a lot of these, really very interesting people like Bryce Martin. This was in the 1960s, who subsequently became one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. And let me think who else. I mean, Agnes Martin, who also became very famous, Jennifer Bartlett, Jill Shapiro, all these people who I was buying in those days from Paula Cooper, who's I think the most interesting art dealer in America all these years, and from Leslie Waddington in London.
And were you following a line of taste at that point, or were you literally going on gut feel? What appealed to you?
Yeah, it wasn't. I think it was taste. It was a so-called eye. People felt that I had a so-called eye, but it was not a particular line of taste. It was just people that I responded to, and it was true that I was excited and stimulated by people like Leslie Waddington, but more than that, Paula Cooper in New York, who really were representing people who were right at the beginning of these very fascinating careers, very creative people, and it was very exciting. I was a friend of a man called Max Gordon at the time, who was an architect, was a well-known collector himself, who's now died, and he guided my interest in these people, and I bought, and now they've become very well known. I wish I'd kept them. We hardly have any of them anymore.
I think we might be coming back to that in a moment, but what's
Yeah.
quite interesting here, I think, is that really, just to go back to that point of a dual life, this other side to this other facet to your personality, this interest in art, is actually existing in the background while you're working in investment banking. Now, I suppose the most important question to ask next is, what was the motivation to attend Courtauld? Was this purely just a curiosity thing, or were you, planning your escape?
Well, when I was at Insead, which was a real turning point in my life, Insead was then relatively new. The faculty had been brought in from the Harvard Business School, and it was a very international and exciting period in my life. That MBA. Interestingly enough, although we haven't come to this yet, I learned something there which I never really followed, which was that if you define your objective, if corporations and companies and human beings define their objective very, very precisely, a lot of other things fall into place. A lot of subsequent decisions fall into place. Well, I never defined an objective. I never decided to be a very rich investment banker, nor did I or make a lot of money, nor did I decide to become a famous art dealer. I just responded, I think, responded to opportunities as they fell into my lap, and so I never learned. I heard that and still remember it at business school, but I never really pursued a long-term objective. But however, but business school for me, Insead was a tremendous platform, Tom, because I then went to America and started working with Bankers Trust in the international department. I was then hired, or what do they call it? Headhunted by a friend of mine to join First Boston Corporation, which was then the leading, with one of the two leading investment banks in America, representing most of the great blue chip companies in America and raising money in Europe at the euro-dollar bond market for these companies. And I was a part of a small group of Europeans setting up the London office. And we had a wonderful time for a couple of years. I had a wonderful time looking after these big companies and getting to know the insurance companies and pension funds and family offices and banks in Europe, and mostly in Scandinavia, which was my area. So Insead did propel me into that, finally into First Boston, which with Morgan Stanley was the key, which was then the great investment bank in America.
Do take us back though to the point where let's think about all these things running in parallel. The success you're having in investment banking with First Boston, but of course around this time you do, as I was saying before, you do actually attend Courtauld to take an art history degree. I mean, what was the thinking there? Is this, are you beginning to hear that voice inside your head going, this is something I should be pursuing? This investment banking isn't for me for the long term. What was driving that? Is that, as I said before, is that curiosity, or are you sort of thinking of an alternative career at this point?
Yes, no. I wasn't thinking of an alternative career so much as wanting to create a structure, a discipline for me to learn about the art that I was buying.
Wow. Okay.
And although Anthony Blunt, who was my tutor, was a sort of a Baroque specialist, if you like, and had become the most famous scholar on Poussin. It was really, I was just interested in art history as a whole, as a sort of structure for me to develop. And I did, in the beginning of my study there, I was still working banking, and then took off the last year. And this left me at the end of the Courtauld with nothing to hand. At that moment, I didn't have a profession and couldn't go back, or didn't want to go back to investment banking, and started working, however, with a former Insead friend of mine who'd set up a art investment company in Geneva, and which had a very interesting concept. And I worked at that with him for a year, trying to raise money for it.
Right. Okay.
And it folded.
Okay.
And it was at that point that I had a beautiful house in Clapham, which I bought with my wife and my then wife. And a big turning point happened when Thomas Gibson, who was a major art dealer at the time, working with Marlborough, who was also living in the same square, the same Crescent Grove in Clapham, came to have lunch with us. And he pivoted my whole life round from one direction to another by telling me that Jacob Rothschild, who had bought Colnaghi, this prestigious old art dealing establishment in Bond Street, a couple of years before, had injected new management into this company, had laid off some of the older people working in it, but was having a tremendous amount of turnover with the younger people that he was putting in, who was meant to sort of stimulate a new approach. And Thomas suggested that I approach Jacob, offering myself as somebody who could manage Colnaghi, because of my financial background on the one hand and my art history background on the other, a perfect combination to be a good businessman and a good art dealer at the same time, which was a very ambitious thought, and I was in no way equipped to do that. But I did get in touch with Jacob. I was told that he had very little time to see me, but eventually he did see me for a few minutes, and he said that I've got very little time, but I will ask you one question. Are you a self-starter? And in those days, I didn't know what a self-starter was. It wasn't such a ubiquitous term as it is these days. And I said, yes, I am. And he said, okay, well, you can start with a small group of people around him in his private office who were meant to be generating ideas to make money. And a few days after I'd started with Jacob, he called me to say, would I be prepared to accompany him to Switzerland to try to raise money with the Swiss Bank Corp, a large bank in Switzerland, for an art investment company. And I said, of course, I'm too delighted to do that. And on the way back, we were there for a day and a half. And on the way back, in the airplane, the British Airways, I shall never forget it, he was sitting by the window and I was sitting at the aisle. He turned to me and he said, tell me, Michael, how much money have you made? And I then thought, well, let me see, 365 days divided by 11 days, where I've been working with you, and multiplied by my salary for the annual salary. And I came up with a number which may or may not have been correct. And there was a pause, and he said, no, I don't mean how much money have you made. How much money have you made me? And I said, oh my God, Jacob, but I haven't had a chance to make any money for you yet because I've only been with you 11 days and getting to know the office, and you've now taken me to Switzerland. Thank you very much. And there was a terrible pause, and he looked at me with this glacial look. He said, but you told me that you were a self-starter. And I tell you, even telling you that now makes my hair raise on the back of my neck because it was so frightening. But it was a lesson I never forgot, that, in capitalism, you're employed really for only one reason, to make money for your employer. And anyway, so that led to a number of other projects that he proposed that I look after for him, one of which was going to Portugal where there was a communist revolution happening, and could I do some deals and make money there and do some deals. And I did go to Portugal for a month. I was completely unsuccessful. I had no idea how to exploit this revolutionary situation to make money for Jacob by buying, I think, distressed assets, distressed works of art. But this all led to eventually his proposal that I work to sell, market, do an exhibition of his cousin, Baron Edmond de Rothschild, Baron Edmond de Rothschild at Château de Prigny in Geneva, his collection of Persian and Mughal miniatures and manuscripts and textiles. And this was one of the greatest collections in the world. It had been formed by his grandfather, the first Baron Edmond, in the 19th century, and it come down to Edmond. And this was at a period when the Shah Banu, the Empress of Iran, was buying back the Persian heritage all over the world at often huge prices, anything to get back what had actually left Iran in the 19th century when Iranian life, Persian society was in disarray, and European collectors were buying, and not just buying, often just taking stuff out of Persia. And so for the next couple of years, I was working on that project, which was totally fascinating, and back and forth to Iran. I established very good friendships with Persians in Iran who've remained very close friends today. I became passionately interested in Persian culture and history and art. And it all led eventually to assembling not just Baron Edmond's collection, the Rothschild collection, but other collections as well that we bought along the way. And we put this all into a publication and an exhibition at Colnaghi in 1976, which was one of the greatest exhibition ever done of Persian miniatures and manuscripts and textiles and carpets. Meantime, we sold, as you saw, the Polonaise carpet to the Empress, the Polonaise Persian carpet for £1 million, which was then a world record price for a carpet, and opened up this exhibition at the time that the Empress had been invited by the British government to come to London. Jacob took 50 seats at the opera. She was meant to come to the opening of this wonderful exhibition, and never arrived. So we had to sell. We were forced to sell to much of the cream of the collection to the great collectors of the day, the Metropolitan Museum, Sadruddin Khan, who was the uncle of the Aga Khan, who was a very cultivated and passionate collector of Islamic works of art. Sadruddin was one. Stuart Carey Welsh at Harvard, the Harvard Museums, the Fogg Museum at the time, all these, some of the Persian younger collectors. So much of the cream of collection went very quickly that first evening. And the Empress arrived the following day, or rather her advisors arrived the following day. 2/3 of the whole exhibition had already been sold. And they then bought the balance. So it was a huge deal. It was also very commercially very successful for Jacob, but it was also, a very prestigious exhibition, and it was a huge opportunity for me, who went on then dealing in Persian art until the revolution in Iran, and selling to these great collectors all over the world, including the young Persian collectors. Then I had to diversify once the revolution had happened. We had to diversify because there was less buying from the Persians, and certainly from the Persian government, but from the Empress. And we started diversifying into Indian miniatures and manuscripts and Mughal material, and then on to Japan and China, which is over the next few years. And eventually Jacob became chairman of the National Gallery and wanted to divest himself of his commercial art interests. So then I went on my own, working at Carnegie, still as Carnegie Oriental, and then broke away and became independent, and then started working with Chinese antiquities, and then eventually Chinese contemporary, as you know, etc., etc. And it was a very fascinating, adventurous life in the art world.
Yeah, well, let's come back to some of these things. I think we're running ahead, because one of the things that I think is very, very interesting, as much as it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, when you think about that flight out to Switzerland, 11 days in, and Jacob is asking you about how much money you've made him. It's interesting though, because he clearly saw something in you. What do you think it was that he could see in you that made him take you on?
Yes, I don't know what it was that Jacob saw in me. I don't know whether he saw that much in me, but he was somebody who was very open to ideas. He had a very elastic, very brilliant intellect, but a very elastic, receptive mind, which was very open to new ideas. It was also open to new people, often younger people, who he felt were creative in one way or another, creative in making money or creative in ideas. And I think he did assemble people around him who were quite smart and hardworking. I think he always admired total dedication. And I don't know, there was anything more than that, and hoped that I could do well for him. And in fact, because it was such an advantage for me, Tom, to have the Rothschild name behind me and the Carnegie name behind me, it was really very easy for me, much easier than it might have been had I been alone, to put together this great exhibition and go on dealing. I mean, there was a tremendous advantage to have these two very prestigious names behind me. And so it did go well, and we were successful and had a lot of fun and made a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean, did you have, if we just think about when you were talking about your education, your economics education, and one of the lecturers talking about having an idea and having an objective and having a vision, almost knowing where you want to go, and you saying, well, I've never really had that. I've kind of just followed my intuition, my gut feel, let's say. Did you actually have a plan walking into his office when you kind of pitched yourself to him? Did you have a plan, or was this just...
No, I did not have a plan. I was just crossing my fingers that he'd harm me. I think that was the bottom line. I really didn't have a plan. I just wanted a job. And that was really it. But it quickly became apparent that the opportunities were enormous with Jacob. I mean, the opportunities that he provided for me and others were unforgettable, and I shall never be anything but very grateful to him.
Well, what are some of the important lessons that you took from that period in your career that you've carried through into your own business, into your own dealing, and personally and professionally?
Well, I think it's just, it's hard work. I really think it's hard work, and I am prepared to work hard, or still work flat out. And I think it's hard work. And of course, for me, it was such fun. And it was so many opportunities that, especially, we're very, very lucky to work with somebody like Jacob Rothschild. My son, who's now 38 years old, my first son, now works with him as the CEO of his Rothschild Capital Partners and RIT, Rothschild Investment Trust. And he's having the same extraordinary opportunities working with this exceptional man.
Just to summarise where we're at, this all took place during those 8 years while you were at Courtauld. Now, before you would go on to strike out on your own, you made an important discovery in 1979 that you would sell to the Smithsonian Museum that would also inspire a film. What happened exactly?
Yeah, well, that was a fascinating event in my life. The Weber collection, Henri Weber had been one of the great jewelers in the latter part of the 19th century in Paris with Lalique, etc., and very famous, Art Nouveau jeweler. And he'd also been one of the greatest collectors in the world, Greek sculpture, coins, Persian Islamic material, many, many things, impressionists, etc. And his collection of Persian art had been exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1936. And after that, it had vanished. And it was understood that the collection had been confiscated by the Germans during the Second World War, because Henri Weber was in Paris and had a chateau in Normandy outside Paris, which is where it was assumed the collection was. And it had vanished, and nobody had heard of it since then. And in the 1970s, suddenly Sotheby's produced a series of sales of Japanese prints, the greatest Japanese prints that had ever come up at auction, ever been sold, which were Henri Weber's collection. And so everybody suddenly became aware of, oh, maybe his collection still exists, certainly the Japanese part of it. And then people in my field then, which was the Islamic and Persian area, began to think, well, where is this great Persian collection? And who has got it? And nobody could know. Nobody found out. Nobody could tell who owned it. Henri Weber was dead. There was no obvious offspring, etc. However, I discovered through an extraordinary luck who that owner was, who had inherited that collection, who was the nephew, I think it was the nephew, not the grandson, of Henri Weber, who was living in Paris alone, a bachelor, an elderly bachelor. And he had been in communication with Sotheby's to sell the Japanese part of it for millions of dollars, millions of pounds. And again, through a stroke of great fortune, I've found out not only who he was, but what his telephone number was. And I called him. Nobody knew about this man, apart from Sotheby's and the Japanese side. And I said to him that I was who I was, working with Courtauld and Jacob Rothschild, and had done this great exhibition of Persian material. And was there any chance for me to be given the opportunity by him to visit his collection, to see it? And he said, no, there's no way I want anybody to see this collection, and I'm not ever going to sell it, etc., etc. And from 1977, I think it was, Tom, until 1982, I called this man every year and wrote to him and sent him a case of really good claret every single year and kept in touch with him. And suddenly, in 1982, I think it was 1982, he said to me, well, look, I am prepared for you to come over and have a look at the collection. I'm not interested in selling it, but you've taken the trouble to be in touch and we can go and have a look at it. It's actually in America, and it was sent out to America in 1939 before France was invaded. And he and I then went over with somebody who had been very helpful to me, who was an advisor on Persian material to Sotheby's, a man called Toby Felk, who had become a very close friend of mine, and also helping me a lot with dealing in this area. And he and I went over to visit this collection with this man. And we opened up these boxes, which hadn't been opened since these great cases since 1939, and saw one masterpiece after another. It was just exhilarating. And this owner was standing behind us looking at, as we opened up every single beautifully packaged miniature painting. And he said, how much is that? How much is that worth? How much is that worth? And of course, we couldn't produce that sort of data of spontaneously. And a little bit later, he said, well, I'm prepared to sell the whole collection, but only as a collection. And I want to sell it. I don't want to sell it to the Arabs. I only want to sell it to a distinguished institution in the West. And I said, done. And we did a contract, and that was it. And for the next period, for the next year, I tried to sell the Weber collection to the great museums in the West. And it was at a period when the relationships between Iran and America were fraught. And Persian culture was very out of fashion. And none of the American museums wanted to touch it. And it was for many millions of dollars, and it was a very big deal. And eventually, to cut a long story and a very complicated story short, it was acquired by the Smithsonian. So it was a very, very, and it has been exhibited since and published, etc., etc. So it was a big deal and an exciting deal. And there was a movie made out of it called the Weber Affair, which tracked, down how it was all discovered by me, and it was all a sort of. It looks very old-fashioned, that documentary now, but anyway, it was it was a very exciting time.
When you said done and you made a commitment and you signed a contract to find an institution to take it on, did you have an institution in mind? And that sounds like quite an all-encompassing puerile question, but did you really have a vision in mind for where they would end up, or was this just you?
Well, I did. I thought it might go to, I might have gone to the Fogg at Harvard, or to the Metropolitan, or to any one of the great museums in America, including the Smithsonian. And I went into all sorts of negotiations with all these people, and it was always turned down. And then it was very complicated. I got in touch with Sackler, who was a great collector himself, and very, as you know, very famous collecting family. And he was a donator to the Smithsonian, and he said he would help, providing I bought his collection of ceramics. It was all very complicated, but in the end, it did go to the Smithsonian, and it was all due credit to them.
What's quite interesting, of course, is we're talking now about the period in time where you're steering your own ship, as it were, from 1986 onwards.
Yes, indeed.
And what's quite telling here is when you connect the dots, almost looking backwards, and you look at things on a sheet of paper, there's a pattern at play in terms of how you approach dealing. And what begins to emerge is that over a period of between 2 to 5 years, you build collections and develop markets for each of those collections. And you've done this for Islamic, Indian, Japanese, and Chinese works of art. Now, if we fast forward all the way to 2001, we see the same approach. And it's a partnership with Sotheby's that it transpires that you're behind the first major private sale for Chinese contemporary art in the West. Now, what's interesting, the internet is nowhere near as advanced as it is today, back in that point, but you managed to get 1,800 people to attend, working in conjunction with Sotheby's. Now, if we think for a moment about your background as an economist, what you're actually doing here when you're building markets and building collections and seeing things ahead of time, if you will, is you're taking a long-term view and you're betting against the consensus because you're seeing more value than perhaps the market at large does at that point. So the question is, it's a long way around, but how does being able to view the world through the lens of economics influence how you view and buy art, and how do you approach creating a market?
Yes, well, I think that it is true that starting off from that great Persian sale in 1976 with the Rothschild collection, it did become apparent to me, and I did then pursue this concept, that there were areas of the art market that were underdeveloped commercially and intellectually or culturally. And it was exciting for me to be exposed to these areas, try to develop them in one way or another, often by building collections in them, and then making really an investment in them, and then selling them at a profit, and trying to identify areas which were, in quotes, emerging. And this was true of my interest in Japanese culture, and then, Indian sculpture, and then Chinese antiquities, etc., etc. And by 1990, but rather towards the end of the 1980s, I was accumulating Chinese bronzes of the second Bronze Age of China, in other words, bronzes from the 11th, 12th century AD until the 18th century. This was a totally neglected area. And we did a major collection on it, and we sold a lot of it, and it was a big deal. And it was also interesting from an academic point of view, a cultural point of view. It was a landmark. And similarly with Chinese contemporary art, this was brand new, and nobody had really looked, or very few people had really looked into this at all, apart from one dealer in Hong Kong, a famous and good dealer in Hong Kong who was interested in the field. And so I interested in it, my passion for it actually, from 1988 or 89 onwards, was fueled by the fact that I felt it was very undervalued, but it was also fueled by my interest in China and China's emergence, and the very obvious situation in which China was going to be the dominant, in my view, still is, the dominant reality for the rest of history. And identifying the artists emerging out of the liberalization that had happened in China was fascinating. And I went back and forth to China. I met all these artists who were then living in very, very modest conditions, in small rooms, small attics, but were doing very creative thinking and feeling suddenly this surge of self-confidence, both as artists and part of a country which is suddenly re-emerging in the world and reconnecting with its great past. So it was very exciting, but it was very exciting from an artistic point of view, an intellectual point of view, but it was also very exciting from a, if you like, an investment point of view, because I felt this really was an area which could be developed. And so, and I was doing this throughout the 90s and dealing in London, and quite successfully, and having a lot of fun. And then in 2001, we did put together this exhibition of all the key Chinese contemporary artists of the time, all of the great, subsequently been recognized as the great Chinese artists of the time. And we were given, it wasn't even rented by Sotheby's, 20,000 square feet, the top floor of their York Avenue premises, to do this exhibition, and they were completely free. It was just an extraordinary opportunity for me. And we did a major publication, and we did a major show. It was fantastic. We also did Chinese designers, etc. And the opening was so well attended that, as you mentioned, there were just under 2,000 people at the opening, that they had to restrict people coming in because they were frightened that the floor would break down. And the fact is, on the strength of this tremendously successful exhibition, my son was just poised to go to Harvard from England to study at undergrad. And I moved lock, stock, and barrel in literally 2 months and opened a gallery in New York on the strength of this exhibition, thinking, well, I really hit the jackpot and we're going to be really successful in New York. And opened a small gallery opposite the Carlyle Hotel on 76th Street. And worked really hard for the next 3 years, and did a number of exhibitions for a lot of these famous Chinese artists in America. However, and kept a gallery going in in London as well. However, it didn't go quite as well as I'd expected, but and it was quite tough. Although it was, we did the exhibitions and we did a lot of work, but by 2004, suddenly the whole world woke up to the fact that Chinese contemporary art might be a big deal. Um, and we then started to collect with a couple of friends of mine, investors, and formed what I think was the finest private collection of Chinese contemporary art in the world, certainly at that time, called the Estella collection. And we I not only bought the works for it, but I also organized two major museum exhibitions, one with the Louisiana Museum in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and another with the Israel Museum in Israel. And these were major exhibitions of Chinese contemporary culture. And eventually, 3 years later, so we're accumulating from 2004 onwards, and by 2007 August, we'd sold the whole collection. I'd actually hoped to keep it together. We tried to sell it to the government in China. I'd drawn a blank. I couldn't get them to buy it, although it would have been a major achievement for China to have this great Chinese collection, of which there still isn't one in China. And we sold it eventually to Blackwell Bella, a famous dealer in New York, who I thought was then going to sell it to Steve Wynn, one of the great collectors in America, who I hadn't been able to reach directly. And in fact, he bought it, I think, in partnership with Sotheby's, and a few months later they put it in auction. But it was a great opportunity. I think it was fair to say that we really had identified the top Chinese artists of their era. And again, it was great fun to do it.
So in 2001, in conjunction with Sotheby's, you bring Chinese contemporary art to the public consciousness almost.
Yeah, but it was certainly the first major exhibition, I think, in the world, certainly in the West.
Yeah, and of course, what's quite interesting though is you're almost, as you said, 2004 is when the world at large began to appreciate where you were heading. So maybe you were. It's quite interesting. Maybe a couple of years ahead of everybody else. You needed to give people time to wake up and get up to speed with what you were viewing at that time and what you could see the potential.
Exactly. This was well ahead of the curve. This was well ahead of the curve. I think it's true that in this case, I could even use the word vision. I mean, I think I became aware quite early on of really how much creativity was happening in China across the board. And it wasn't just in art, it was in cinema and in philosophy and in theater and in dance. And there was I believe, a cultural revolution happening in China in those years. And it's happening today with even greater intensity. And so it's a big deal for the world. And I think the creativity coming out of China today is fascinating, and which is why I'm still very involved in it.
I think that segues quite nicely into where we're at today, essentially, where you're dealing in works by established masters from China, Hong Kong, Europe, and the United States. And since 1991, again, very, very early, you have been dealing in ink paintings and works on paper from numerous Chinese artists. Now, where a Western artist may use art as a means to express political opinion, a Chinese ink artist has rejected this route of expression. So what I'd like to hear from you is what can you tell us about what a Chinese artist will look to express, and how will this be manifest in its work?
Well, I think in the late 1980s and 90s, Chinese contemporary artists, these artists who I then was working with and subsequently became very famous, those artists were often interested in transmitting a message, of their being subversive and daring in political terms by doing beautifully painted, realistic paintings with political subject matter, and in quotes defying the communism. And they were permitted to do this because of the liberalization in China, and the Western audience to which they were directing their work, because there was no appetite for this in China itself at the time, they were titillating the appetites of the West. And Western collectors were buying these works because they thought that how brave these artists were being, how subversive they were being to communism, etc., etc. And the Chinese artists were very cleverly exploiting that appetite in the West. Now that has changed. There's less appetite for that type of thing in the West. Plus, there's much more control by the current government in China on political statements by artists. But I'm interested, in any case, always was, in the so-called ink artists who were not interested in any way disseminating a political message, and still aren't. They are interested in trying to create a new pictorial language, which is, I think, akin to what Picasso and Braque and Cézanne were doing in the early part of the 20th century, namely looking back at European old masters like Leonardo and Poussin and Michelangelo and Raphael and Velázquez, in order to, through their study of the old masters, find a means to establish a new revolutionary language which would be pertinent to today. That's what happened in the first 15 to 20 years of the 20th century. There was a revolution in art, cubism, abstraction, etc. And this is, I think, what the ink artists are doing today in China. They're studying the old masters, the Chinese old masters, in order to find a new language which will mean something to this huge new population in China today. And I think they're the most adventurous and idealistic artists working in China today, the ink artists. And for me, that's fascinating. We also, as you note, we are also working with some Western artists, American, English, German, French, etc., who are not necessarily ink artists, or some of them may be using ink or deploying ink, but they're interested in not so much transmitting a political message or a politically correct message, which is more fashionable today, but are interested in art for art's sake, to put it in old-fashioned term, and are trying to make art which is meaningful but can also be beautiful.
Mm-hmm. How do you think an ink artist will seek to provoke a reaction in the viewer? Therefore, if they're kind of shunning or disinterested in this notion of politicizing things, how will they provoke a reaction?
Yeah, well, I think that for the Chinese, the ink artists are extremely relevant because they're working with ink, which was invented in China. They're working with paper, which was invented in China. One of the greatest possible manifestations of Chinese culture over 2,000 years was ink painting, landscape painting and calligraphy. So for the Chinese buyer today, for the Chinese scholar today, Chinese contemporary ink artists can be seen as being totally relevant to the past, but are making works which are manifestation of Chinese culture, of the greatest, the longest continuation of culture in the world. So for them, it's very relevant. I think with for the Western collectors, their response is due to the fact that they recognize that this is a major turning point in Chinese culture, that this great civilization is being expressed today in ink terms, in relevant terms for the Chinese, and producing works of exceptional beauty. So I think for the collector observers in the West, Chinese ink paintings are arrestingly beautiful, extremely good quality, and at the same time express in contemporary terms one of the great civilizations of human history.
Yeah, I mean, this leads quite nicely into a note here I've got. I mean, you've got a number of short films on your website, and there's one called Changing China, and in it you reference scholar and curator Britta Erickson, for having said of the ink artist movement being the most, in quotes, idealistic and intellectually daring cultural movement in China for the last 50 years. I'd like to know what you think she is referring to here, and what makes the work particularly courageous in your eyes.
Well, I think that the contemporary ink artists' work today is courageous because it runs counter to world contemporary fashion, which has very much a political content, and all over the world, and even in China. The ink artists are courageous because they are doing what the very courageous things that Braque and Cézanne and Picasso were doing and Kandinsky at the beginning of the 20th century, namely really trying to make something new, to do a revolution, but a revolution that can only come out can only come out of the past, out of study of the past, out of a total absorption of the past. Other revolutions don't work if they're just sort of brand new, so to speak. So I think that's really what it is about the ink artists, that they are charting a whole new world, and one which is so relevant to capture what has been so important about Chinese civilization in the past, this great culture, this great respect for education, for learning, for intellectual life, which is unique.
Do you think they're pioneers?
They're completely pioneers, and they go back to the scholarly world. And don't forget that China was the only civilization on earth that was run by scholars. The scholar gentry were the people who ran the country for thousands of years, and that's unique. It has never happened elsewhere.
Now, on your Instagram profile, it's quite nice actually as an outsider looking in. It serves as an intimate window into aspects of your professional and your personal life. Your dog Loki makes an appearance. Emily Pugh, with some of her works, was a recent post. Drinking wine with your brother. You're also a father to 3 children. How has your career in art influenced your role as a parent? And how important do you think art is in helping promote independence of thought in the youth?
Well, to take your the second question first, I think that I don't know how important art is for children growing up. I tell you, I think that for me, music is more important. My 2 younger children who live in Boston, who are now 13 and 11, are both musical. And I think that access to music, to good music, is a wonderful part of growing up, more important than art. So if they're also become interested in art, so much the better, because that connects you with art, with history, with art history, and therefore history, and is a very enriching and wonderful way to live and learn to live. But I don't think it's, for me, the key thing, and I haven't instilled it in my children at all so far. My elder son, anyway, is too old for it now. And how has it affected my parenting? Well, I don't know. I think unfortunately, I don't see my younger children enough, but I think that being interested in art, which I am, is enriching and so enjoyable, and I think it gives one an appetite for life, for wanting to see more of life and find life as an adventure. So it's for me, it's a great thing, and I hope I can, my personality has been affected by it, and that will in some way be nice for the children. I hope so.
An adventure is a nice way to describe it. Just on purely from a point of view of curiosity, what makes music, to your mind, more important than visual art in that sense?
Well, I think that, when I listen to musicians talking about music, I find they are very, very interesting. They tend to be very intelligent, cultivated, articulate. If I listen to artists talking about their art, it is a very different matter. And they often talk a lot of nonsense, because their way of expressing themselves is through their art, and that's how they do it coherently. Musicians manage to do it in language as well as in music.
I'd like you to picture in your mind now yourself in your 30s, ready to embark on your career and the things we've covered in the art world. And with the benefit of experience, if you could go back and give yourself advice back then, what would it be?
Well, my record of giving advice to myself and to other people is not a good one. So I would be very wary of this, answering this question. But I think that, I think unfortunately, I think I would just go along with the fashionable view, which is go along with your passion. Try to develop something that you're really interested in and go for it. With me, the problem was that I was interested in a lot of different things. I didn't have a strong strategic view of how I should develop my life and go for a particular specific objective. So I was open to anything coming along, as any opportunities dropped into my lap, and I was happy to have an adventure. And it wasn't a very intelligent way to approach life, because I think I would have done much better if I'd had a very specific single objective and gone for it for 30 or 40 years. As it happened, it's been great fun so far, and it's still fun. I was lucky. A lucky boy.
Thank you for listening. You can follow and subscribe to The Bigger Picture wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about this episode or to reach out to us directly, please visit rcarter.com.